Ukraine is still locked in a battle for survival. But what if could secure the ultimate protection without even becoming a NATO member? 3 years into the war, Italy has introduced a groundbreaking plan that could extend NATO's Article 5 protection to Ukraine without requiring full membership. If this plan moves forward, it could redefine military alliances and put Russia in a nearly impossible position. The timing is critical. Ukraine's relationship with the US is rapidly deteriorating after a failed meeting between Trump and Zelensky. Meanwhile, NATO itself is divided, and several European nations are quietly exploring their own peacekeeping efforts in Ukraine. So what exactly is Italy's bold new proposal? Could it push NATO into action, or even edge Europe closer to war? And why is the US shifting away from Ukraine at a time when it needs support the most? Let's break it all down. First, let's examine the details of Prime Minister Meloni's proposal from March 6th. According to a report by Ukrainska Pravda, one of the most reliable sources on the Ukraine conflict, Meloni suggested that Ukraine could receive the benefits of NATO's collective defense principle, central to Article 5, without officially joining the alliance. Meloni even stated, "I believe this would be a more stable, lasting, and effective security guarantee than some of the other proposals I've seen." This was a direct reference to various peacekeeping and ceasefire ideas floating around in recent weeks, especially after the US took a dramatic step away from NATO's long-standing stance and moved closer to Russia's position. The proposal, if taken to its extreme, could suggest NATO's Article 5 protection might extend to any country in the world, not just NATO members. However, in reality, the idea of extending it specifically to Ukraine appears to be an improvised solution for a highly complex issue with no easy answers. As expected, reactions to the plan have been mixed. So far, no major world leaders have officially endorsed it, but this doesn't necessarily mean good or bad news. Instead, it reflects how unconventional this approach to military alliances is. It may take time before experts and politicians fully assess its potential impact. So what exactly is Ukraine's relationship with NATO? And why is this proposal so controversial? Ukraine's ties with NATO date back to its independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since then, the country has alternated between pro-Russian and pro-Western leadership. In the 1990s, Ukraine cooperated with NATO but remained neutral, maintaining ties with both the West and Russia. In 1994, Ukraine, along with Russia, the US, and the UK, signed the Budapest Memorandum, agreeing to return its Soviet-era nuclear stockpile to Russia in exchange for security assurances against territorial threats. By 1997, Ukraine formalized its cooperation with NATO through a charter on a distinctive partnership. However, true momentum toward NATO membership didn't build until the 2004 Orange Revolution, when pro-Western President Viktor Yushchenko came to power. Yushchenko pushed for closer EU ties, sparking discussions about NATO membership. However, Russian influence within Ukraine kept support for NATO low, creating internal divisions that complicated the process. By 2010, Ukraine's political landscape shifted again when Viktor Yanukovych took office. He reversed many pro-Western policies and formally declared Ukraine a non-aligned state, eliminating any immediate prospects for NATO membership. In 2013, Yanukovych rejected an EU trade deal, igniting mass protests known as the Euromaidan movement. The protests led to Yanukovych's ousting, and Ukraine returned to a pro-Western stance. However, before the new government could implement NATO-friendly policies, Russia seized Crimea in 2014 and fueled conflict in eastern Ukraine, a move widely seen as an effort to prevent Ukraine from aligning with the West. The annexation of Crimea was a clear attack on Ukraine's territorial integrity, reinforcing its desire to join NATO. By 2017, NATO membership became an official national objective, and in 2019, it was even written into Ukraine's constitution. The country began making major reforms to meet NATO standards, tackling corruption, upgrading its military, and strengthening democratic institutions. But NATO remained cautious, fearing that admitting Ukraine would provoke Russia and escalate tensions. For Russia, Ukraine's NATO ambitions have long been a red line. Moscow views NATO expansion as a direct threat to its security and influence, especially in former Soviet territories. Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly denounced NATO's presence near Russia's borders, seeing Ukraine's alignment with the West as completely completely unacceptable. Ukraine's cultural and historical ties with Russia made this issue even more sensitive, differentiating it from Baltic nations that joined NATO without facing similar backlash. In fact, Russia's opposition to NATO expansion was a key factor in its decision to invade Ukraine in February 2022. The Kremlin justified its invasion by claiming it was protecting pro-Russian Ukrainians and preventing NATO's expansion, even though NATO had not formally offered Ukraine membership at the time. This ongoing struggle between Russia and Ukraine over NATO has followed a predictable pattern. Every time Ukraine moves closer to the West, Russia reacts aggressively, claiming defensive motives while actually asserting its own geopolitical influence. One key reason Russia invaded Ukraine was to prevent it from joining NATO. By occupying Ukrainian territory, Russia ensured Ukraine remained in an unresolved territorial dispute, something that has historically complicated NATO membership for other countries. NATO has generally been reluctant to accept nations with active conflicts, as doing so could trigger Article 5 and potentially drag the entire alliance into war. The NATO membership process technically follows an open-door policy, meaning any European country can apply. However, new members must meet strict criteria, and all existing members must unanimously approve their entry. More importantly, NATO's founding articles, especially Article 8, require that new members have no existing international conflicts that contradict the treaty's principles. Ukraine's war with Russia directly challenges these principles, making its membership a legal and strategic dilemma. Beyond that, admitting a country already in active conflict could instantly trigger Article 5, committing NATO nations to war. But what exactly does Article 5 say? The key section of Article 5 states, "An armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all." This means that if Ukraine were a NATO member, an attack from Russia would legally require NATO to respond militarily. Given this reality, Italy's proposal presents a highly unconventional solution, offering Ukraine the same protection as NATO members without official membership. If this idea gains traction, it could reshape global alliances, redraw military strategies, and force Russia into making some tough choices. But will NATO actually back this idea? And what could the consequences be? As the world watches, one thing is clear: the stakes have never been higher.